It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
2 years ago, Vermont became the 11th state to legalize adult use cannabis. Now, adults 21 and over can legally purchase cannabis from licensed dispensaries, and it's big business, exceeding expectations. In 2023, dispensaries sold $58 million worth of product, generating $11 million in tax revenue. This year, as of October, sales reached $128 million, generating $25 million in tax revenue, which comes from a 14% excise tax and the state's 6% sales tax. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, I spoke with James Pepper, chair of the Vermont Cannabis Control Board, about the progress and potholes in the 2-year experience and some of the ideas the board hopes to implement in the future. First, a word from our sponsor. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. All right, let's begin. How did you wind up in this job?
Well, depends on how far back you want to go. I had worked for Peter Shumlin as a senior policy analyst, and in his last term, he really wanted to do tax and regulate. And we had this RAND report. The RAND Corporation came in and tried to give us some suggestions on what it might look like. We would have been, at the time, the only legal state on the East Coast, which presents some real unique challenges because people are willing to drive. People come to Vermont anyway. Vermont already has a reputation for good cannabis, and so we needed to really figure out how to do this. And we would have had to do it at a scale that would be unnatural for Vermont just because of the federal status. So he put me in charge, and he said, hey, listen, we're going to do this. Call up Colorado, call up Oregon, Washington, Alaska, figure out what they did well, figure out what they did poorly. And we drafted a bill. It eventually, largely through the support of Dick Sears, made it through the Senate, failed pretty spectacularly in the House. That bill eventually led to legalizing kind of possession and home grow, the kind of more Vermont track. But in the interim, between Peter Shumlin and 2020 when the bill passed, I was a prosecutor, deputy state's attorney in the central office, doing a lot of legislative work. And, I worked on that Phil Scott's Marijuana Advisory Commission, he called it. When he vetoed the bill, he kind of assembled his cabinet and, kind of asked them to chart a path forward. So I was working on that in the kind of highway safety subcommittee. When the opportunity came up, I just decided to throw my hat in. The only interesting thing there is I didn't apply to be the chair of this board. You had to kind of specially designate that if you wanted that. And, I think when I got the call from the governor, he asked if I would run the thing. And he did mention I wasn't exactly his first choice, but, I was the last man standing. And I think he went through a couple of people first. It's a challenging job, so I don't begrudge anyone who kind of withdrew from the process. But that's how I ended up here.
When you say people already knew about Vermont, were coming to Vermont, are you talking about pre-legalization? We had a reputation?
Yeah, you talk to kind of everyone in the know, and it's kind of Humboldt County, California, and Vermont are the two kind of places that pre-legalization just have a real reputation for growing high-quality weed.
And why is that?
It's a plant.
Something in the dirt?
It could be something in the dirt. There's all sorts of kind of science around these microclimates around Vermont. But really, it's just a plant that the more you care for it and the more attention you give it and the more you kind of look for the right genetics and try and breed the right genetics, you can really do something special with it. And there's so many different compounds in the cannabis plant, and you can try and kind of pheno hunt for the ones you want. And we just have people that love the plant here, and they take a lot of care and time and we're seeing that in the regulated market now. We've captured a lot of the kind of former legacy market in the regulated market, and we're seeing just an incredible diversity of flower in the regulated side.
How much did you know about marijuana?
Very little. And it's funny because you look around the country and who are the kind of people in charge of these marijuana boards, these cannabis boards, and they all kind of have the same background. They've worked in the legislature a lot. They've kind of made themselves known in the kind of political class. This is a new industry and it requires continuous attention and continuous kind of refinement of the laws that govern it. While I don't have a lot of experience with the plant itself prior to this, I've been able to shepherd kind of good housekeeping bills through the legislature every year to make sure that this market and the rules that govern it are current and actually kind of responsive to what the industry needs and what the public health kind of aspects needs.
Being a stoner was not a qualification for the job?
No, no. We do, all of 3 board members, when we were first appointed, it's kind of like, who are these yahoos? Like why these guys? Oh, we got a former prosecutor. Great. We have, someone with an HR background. Well, what's that going to do? One board member does have kind of an agriculture and economic development
there you go.
mindset. But, yeah, I think there was a lot of hesitation when we first started. But, one of our first decisions out of the gate was, is our compliance team going to be cops or is it going to be people that actually know a thing or two about cannabis? And if you look, our director of compliance, his entire career was at the Agency of Agriculture. He created the cannabis quality program, the hemp program at the Agency of Agriculture, has all the scars from that and kind of the lessons learned from that. But, we doubled down on people that knew the plant, knew the kind of pesticides, knew the kind of landscape of the legacy market and kind of some of the pitfalls there. And we've hired a really, cohesive team that understands cannabis deeply and the people that kind of grow this stuff.
You said a minute or two ago it was a challenging, difficult job, and I'm thinking to myself, really?
I say that just because, you ask, do I know the plant? Well, frankly, that's one aspect of the industry. And then you have kind of the good manufacturing practices and commercial kitchen side of things. You've got retail sales and all the public safety issues. You have the insurance problem and kind of working with DFR. You got tax collection. You have to kind of be in charge of the plant from seed to sale and everything in between, soup to nuts. And it's very challenging because you don't have the support of the other agencies. Agency of Agriculture won't step foot on a cannabis farm. So all the soil testing and pesticide oversight that they would do for other industries, they just don't do for cannabis. The Department of Health won't step foot to certify a commercial kitchen for a cannabis manufacturer. Public safety, they'll take calls, if there's a public safety problem, but really, the governor designated Department of Liquor and Lottery as our kind of enforcement division, essentially, or we have criminal activity going on. So every agency that would normally deal with kind of aspects of this industry, they have the ultimate right to kind of throw up their hands and say, sorry, we take federal money, we're not going to get involved with your industry.
Okay, so that's the issue.
Yeah, it's just the federal status means that anyone who's taking that money, they're a legal argument to make that they can't deal with any sort of plant-touching industries.
Wow. Okay. Let's just make sure everybody understands one term you have used and we'll probably use again, legacy market. Can I just roughly translate that to the previous illegal pot sellers of before?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. I mean,
that's a nice way legacy is sort of a nice, clean way to describe it, but yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of stigma and a lot of, there's a complicated history to cannabis, and even the word cannabis can get confusing for folks at times. But marijuana was largely a derogatory term. The black market has some derogatory implications, and so really, we try and say cannabis. It can get confusing at times when you're trying to distinguish between high THC cannabis, marijuana, and hemp, low THC cannabis. But I generally like to use the legacy market or the heritage market and then cannabis instead of marijuana.
Mm-hmm. You brought it up, let's go right there, which is the THC count in the marijuana that's now being sold, the flower, I guess you now call it. I was looking up some of the stores and some of the sites that are selling it now, and I mean it's just mind blowing how high the THC count is compared to 60s and 70s, 1 to 3%. Now we're talking upwards of 30. I mean, that's some really strong stuff. Do you think people are really aware how potent this stuff is?
No, and I think that the kind of blind drive towards higher and higher potency cannabis is really an outgrowth of this federal illegality. And I say that because we have not spent the time like other countries have in studying some of the other cannabinoids in cannabis and the kind of how they interact with one another. So when people go into a store and they're thinking, well, I want the kind of best bang for my buck or the highest quality, they're using that THC potency as the marker of the kind of measuring stick for what they're looking for. And unfortunately, if people knew a little bit more about the terpenoids and the flavonoids and the other aspects, the other compounds in cannabis and how they interact with one another, I think that, the conversation would be a little bit different and we wouldn't see kind of people trying to just look for the highest potency. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's hard to sell flower that's under 20% THC. That we're seeing that all over the place. Frankly, it's not good for our public health outcomes. It's just not, there are very well documented things like cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, cannabis use disorder that are being driven by these kind of higher potency products.
Is part of your job, part of the board's job here to educate people?
It is, yes.
So what sort of programs do you have in place that do that?
Yeah, I mean, we have all of our bud tenders, anyone who's interacting with a customer is required to go through an educational program. The problem is usually what that education entails is what you can't say to a customer. You can't be saying, oh, well, this strain will help you go to sleep. This strain will help you, cure your cancer or whatever else, whatever health claims that people like to kind of associate with certain products. We've been working with one of the leading researchers on the kind of neuropharmacology of cannabinoids. We've are trying to develop a better educational program about how cannabis can certain aspects, certain compounds within cannabis have drug-to-drug interactions. If someone comes in and says, I'm on 7 different medications, I have MS, what do I do? I want to kind of take something for pain. Which strain should I use? What product should I get? Well, we don't really want bud tenders kind of entering their own kind of subjective feelings into that. So we're working with this person to help develop a more robust educational program. I mean, the science on this is all cutting edge. It's all evolving very quickly. We just have to kind of rely on these people that are in the field to develop the educational programs. But it's not something that we put in place at the outset. We have the basic educational program, and now we're trying to enhance it.
When I was asking you, though, about public health information, I was thinking more the consumer. You were really talking more about what you call the bud tenders, people selling it.
Well, that's that main point of information exchange is the customer talking to the bud tender. But when it comes to the basic public health stuff, I should say that we had the legislature created an advisory committee for us. Dr. Levine, Commissioner of Health, served on that. He was the head of our public health subcommittee of that advisory committee. And so the Department of Health is the primary author of all of our point of sale flyers. It's a 4-page document that kind of lists all of the potential side effects and the health concerns around cannabis. They're also the primary author of our health warning label that's on every product.
Okay. Because I'm thinking of all the drug ads we see on TV where they list all the side effects at the end and speed it up to about a 78 RPM. And, I mean, if you can actually remember anything they said. And they all seem to have about 70 different side effects.
Yeah, especially things that contravene the very purpose of taking the pill,
right.
In the first place.
Yeah.
Well, so, I mean, I mentioned our point of sale flyer, which has a lot of that, the kind of like the negative consequences or the kind of potential side effects of cannabis is about 4 pages long. So we're in a similar situation here.
Why would somebody who's selling marijuana, why are they going to be telling people anything other than you should buy this product?
Well, I think what you're seeing, well, first of all, the bud tenders in this industry are usually very enthusiastic about cannabis. You know, this is the first time they've been able to do their passion and get a paycheck for it. And what we're seeing is the fastest growing demographic of new consumers, these kind of low information consumers, are people 55 and older that are on several medications and want to maybe drop one or drop two. You know, they've taken a pill for sleep and then they're taking another pill to reduce the side effects of that first pill that they're on. And so they're going in and having in-depth conversations. I don't know if you've ever been into a shop, but what I see every time I've ever been in is usually a slightly older person having a really complicated, in-depth conversation with the bud tender about, we have over 3,000 registered or over 4,000 registered products in the state. And so, you go in and you see these menus and it's just like 15 pages long of various things that you could, and it's overwhelming for a lot of people. And the bud tender really becomes that central point of kind of information.
Is marijuana, according to your board, is it considered to be a safe product, or is it just that it's out there and we might as well try to contain and control it?
It's hard to know exactly what you mean by safe. If you look at
is it bad for your health?
Well, it's certainly not necessarily good for your health. But when we did that RAND report, the RAND study in 2013 that I had referenced, I mean, they said that a quarter of Vermont adults use cannabis regularly, which they define as past 30 days, at least once in the past 30 days. That is the highest level. I mean, we flip-flop with Oregon sometimes, but that's the highest level in the country of use. What other product is out there? Alcohol, cereal, whatever else that people are using with such regularity that doesn't have any regulatory overlay over it. It's actually kind of alarming when you see those numbers. And so whether you want to call it harm reduction or whatever else, yeah, I think anything that we can do to shift those consumers into a regulated space and give them a product that's been tested, that has an accurate label and has been through some kind of regulatory overlay or scheme is going to be a net benefit for public health. So is it safe? One thing that's pretty interesting to me is that the FDA and the Agency of Health and Human Services federally, for the first time ever, just acknowledged that there are therapeutic medicinal uses for cannabis. They said that it can be helpful in the treatment of anorexia, for nausea related to chemotherapy, and for pain. They came out with 3, medical uses for cannabis, which I don't think is surprising to anyone. Yeah. We have over 40 states that have medical programs, medical cannabis programs. We have over 6 million medical patients for cannabis. And there's actually a number of approved FDA THC drugs on the market. So I think it's relatively safe. Is it healthy? I think that's up for, it kind of depends on how you want to define the question.
But the motivation, you've been here on the ground level of this. The motivation seems to me at least was really more about trying to capture revenue. Is that a fair statement?
Cannabis policy always makes strange bedfellows. If we really wanted to capture revenue, we would have legalized in 2016 when Shumlin proposed it. The RAND report said people would be willing to drive up to 200 miles for legal cannabis. So you take the border of Vermont, draw kind of a 200-mile concentric circle around it, and you're supplying cannabis for the vast majority of the New England and the northern states. That would have been an amazing cash grab for the state if they wanted to do it back then. And we could have done it. We could have done it through the legislature, passed the Senate. It could have happened. But they took their time. They waited. And so there's certainly those fiscal hawks that want that revenue. But there's also the kind of harm reductionists, the people that look at all those people consuming cannabis and say, no, they should have a choice between the illicit market and the regulated market. And then, this bill would have never crossed the finish line if it didn't do something about kind of equity, stop the arrests, expunge those criminal history records, stop turning people into criminals, for selling a plant that is ubiquitous in this state. And then there's the libertarians, of course, the Joe Bennings of the world that just said, why is the government telling us what we can and can't put in our body? So I think the tax revenue is an important piece of it. And frankly, the 14% excise tax and the 6% sales tax make regulated cannabis pretty pricey. But there's kind of a coalition of support around cannabis policy.
Joe Benny, of course, the state senator from Caledonia County.
Right. Just to back up a second, one of the objectives of the legislature, they wrote it directly into the law, was for the Cannabis Board to attempt to shift the legacy market, the current growers and the current consumers, into the regulated market. So we created a market structure that would be very unattractive to larger kind of multi-state operators, very attractive for smaller operators, reduce the barriers to entry on the small scale side. The kind of downside about bringing in a bunch of legacy operators, you want them in. You absolutely want their genetics in. You want the kind of care and personal touch, the craft product that they've spent decades cultivating. But this is a group of people that have never been subject to any regulation, let alone the most intense form of regulation, both at the state and federal level, trying to educate people on the need for child-resistant packaging, the need to not use certain pesticides even though they're listed as organic, the need to kind of have your product tested and have it sampled properly. And we have always tried to take an education-first approach to compliance. We have this complex regulatory scheme, and we know that it's new for everyone, and that it's overbearing, and it can kind of crush people in the amount of paperwork that, tracking your plants from seed to sale. It's the inventory tracking, product registration. And so we have a team of 7 people on our compliance division, and they are out in the field walking people through regulations every day. We have not had major issues to date. And it's mostly because we really try to kind of sit down with our operators for 2-3 hours at a time and kind of just walk them through, okay, well, you've grown this plant. The next step is you got to go dry it and enter it into inventory tracking. And, you need to start thinking about who the next people in the supply chain are that you're going to sell to. We have a very typical process that we kind of copied from the Agency of Agriculture around notices of violation and getting people into corrective action plans. We try not to be punitive, especially for the people that are making unintentional mistakes. We've had a few issues where we've had to pull people's licenses or suspend them, but generally speaking, this is an industry that is very excited to be able to do the thing that they love out in the open, out in the daylight, and deposit the money that they're getting into a bank account and pay their mortgage, pay their rent, whatever else, doing something that they've always done, but now they can do it openly.
And let's be clear that the growers are separate from the retailers.
They don't have to be, but the vast majority of our licensees, I think we have right around 560 total businesses. I think around 380 of those are cultivators. So that's the vast majority. But we do have a number of retail. You're allowed to vertically integrate if you want to. You can apply for kind of all 5 of our license types, now 6, but you can be a cultivator that also has a product manufacturing license, also has a retail license, and kind of go direct to market that way. But the vast majority of our licensees are cultivators.
All cash business, right? Because of the federal requirements or the federal issues?
For the most part, yes. We do. There are some kind of debit cards are allowed, but they sometimes get shut off. Sometimes just randomly, you can go into a cannabis shop and they'll say all cash today. Sorry, for some reason the credit card machine won't process payments. So for the most part, cash. One of the requirements and rule is that you have a depository account if you're a cannabis business. So the federal credit union or the state credit unions have really stepped in to fill that void. They're serving Vermonters. VSECU, now Early Rise or something, has been in the cannabis industry in Vermont since 2015 when the first medical dispensaries opened.
How do you make sure in a cash business that you're seeing all the revenue that you should see?
I know to me, it's absolutely insane that the federal government has not stepped into this. They wrote when Colorado legalized and they said, they had to make a choice back in 2013, 2014, whether they were going to allow this to go forward. Well, they put out the kind of 10 commandments of the federal government, Cole memoranda that would kind of deprioritize prosecution of cannabis businesses if they followed these kind of scripture. And it was all about making sure that cartels and gangs and organized crime were not getting into the industry. Well, what better way to incentivize organized crime to get into this by having it be an all cash industry? I mean, it's crazy. But we have inventory tracking, so every plant has to be weighed and entered into a state system. We have kind of an analytics model that really kind of spots bad actors and kind of flags suspicious activity for us. And then the banks have a backup one too. They also require weekly suspicious activity reports for people who are depositing cash. And so there are kind of complex algorithms that are kind of keeping an eye on this industry. And then the tax department has their own system, and they have a 3-year look back audit ability. And so they're going to kind of selectively audit people that are looking like maybe are have a side hustle or something along those lines.
I mean, it would seem that we catch really gross violations, but you're also talking about a product. Don't all the retailers set their own prices?
They do, yes.
Okay, so how would you? I mean, I guess you're talking about a range of price which you're keeping an eye on. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of their point of sale systems interact directly in real time with our inventory tracking. So we're seeing all their sales in real time, and they don't really. I mean, starting up a cannabis business is very expensive, especially a retail business. And they're making money. No one wants to risk just to get a couple extra bucks on the side. No one's willing to kind of put their entire livelihood on the line. And, an interesting thing about this industry, of course, is there's no bankruptcy protection. So, you're putting and there's no lending from banks. So you're putting up all your own private capital to start up a cannabis business. And it's just, it's a high ropes, high wire act.
Yeah.
And to kind of think that people are going to actively try and subvert, I mean, maybe, but, there's multiple checks along the way of people keeping an eye on that.
Interesting. I hadn't considered that, but that's, I'm sure, the case where you can't borrow money from an FDIC operation for something that the federal government doesn't approve of. And I didn't realize that they had no bankruptcy protection.
Yeah, one of the big things that we're going to be looking at, asking the legislature, is really around end of life cycle, because we're starting to see it now. We had a retailer in Mooresville that needed to close operations abruptly, sitting on $100,000 worth of product that he's no longer allowed to even be in the same room as. So we're looking at kind of how licenses can transfer, and how do we need kind of specialized receivership, statutory authority to kind of appoint a wholesaler to kind of take over that business when it does close, and the kind of owner's no longer allowed to kind of even step through the door.
What happened there?
It was a complicated situation with the owner. I think there was he got into some trouble and then tried to transfer his business license to someone else without a board approval. And so we had to kind of shut down the store, and we worked with DLL to remove the product, have it stored, and kind of get it back into the hands of the people that kind of he purchased it from.
DLL, Department of Liquor and Lottery.
Right.
Okay.
And then so the governor in his 10-point safety plan said he kind of created a partnership between the Cannabis Board and DLL when there's kind of criminal law implications, because our compliance team are not, sworn law enforcement.
What's the background check that you run potential retail sellers and also, I guess, growers on?
It's every licensee. Anyone who owns at least 10% of a license has to go through the same process. And it's a just 50 state background check. We look at criminal, civil, and administrative law rulings against people. Every state kind of evolves. It used to be in Colorado, you have any conviction for any felony, you're out. You can't get a license. When one of your stated objectives of cannabis is to try and encourage participation by the former legacy market, well, a lot of those former legacy growers have simple possession or distribution charges, convictions, historic convictions for those. That's the industry that they're in. Vermont recognizing that that it would be in conflict to just say anyone with a felony conviction can't participate in this industry. They gave the board a lot of flexibility to kind of really look behind the conviction, look at the person. We have a list of kind of presumptively disqualifying offenses, anything with violence, anything with fraud, deceit, abuse, embezzlement, anything that may kind of trigger the kind of federal government taking a closer look at our industry. And so when one of those things turns up, one of those presumptively disqualifying offenses, we have a list of criteria how that applicant can overcome that presumptive disqualification. And it's all the same things that a state's attorney would look at when they're looking at an expungement petition. Like, what was the nature and circumstances of the offense? How old is it? Are there any intervening convictions? Is this kind of a part of a pattern of behavior, or is this an isolated event? That's kind of the rubric that we use to evaluate whether someone poses a kind of present threat to this market.
Are the feds taking a hands-off approach on this, or are they basically waiting for you, retailers, growers to screw up, and they're kind of just waiting for somebody to trip on the sidewalk kind of thing?
They have taken a very hands-off approach. The Cole memoranda came out under the Obama administration, and that kind of governed who could get a license and who the feds were going to be looking into. Under the kind of Trump DOJ, the Jeff Sessions DOJ, Sessions rescinded that, and there was a collective gasp across the country. This is a $33 billion industry. What is going to happen? Are the raids going to resume? The kind of pre-Cole memoranda raids onto cannabis shops. It didn't happen. I think a lot of these businesses are so entrenched now, and the amount of regulation that's governing them is just extreme. Like, you ask about criminal history records and inventory tracking. Like, not many other industries have all the kind of bells and whistles that this one does. The DEA is now looking at rescheduling cannabis. The feds have largely stayed out of the situation.
Go back here. I asked you about education. You talked about educating the bud tenders and what they pass along to the consumers. Is there any sort of program to go into the schools to tell high school kids, we're talking about a 30% potency. Here's what potentially could happen to you?
I would hope so, because the whole just say no, I think that kids chafe against that. And then they really, what they need to know is, just like you said, there are enhanced health risks and potentially long-term health risks, permanent health risks to adolescents and the developing brain using these high-potency products, using cannabis at all. And that's the message I think actually resonates with kids. Like, hey, do you really want to kind of, slow down your development just to kind of smoke some weed? All of the kind of educational components have been outsourced to the Department of Health. Essentially what's going on is there is a 14% excise tax on cannabis, 30% of any of that money that's raised. So last year it was $8 million. That 30% of the 14% excise tax is being reinvested into substance misuse prevention and education. And that's all kind of being led by the Substance Misuse Prevention Advisory Council. They meet, monthly and talk about kind of what's the strategy, the broader strategy for all substances. And then, to me, what's really important, though, is the entirety of the sales tax, 6%. So last year, 6% was $7 million. All of that money is going into after-school programs, expanding access to after-school programs, reducing the cost, adding transportation options for parents, creating new spots. To me, I remember being that age, unsupervised, after school, no positive role models in my life. That is the time when people are, experimenting with illegal substances. And to me, there's no better use of the money than trying to kind of give kids an alternative to smoking cannabis or doing anything else that they shouldn't be, and actually trying to create some kind of sense of community and some sense of kind of, put some positive role models in people's lives.
I hope I'm not sounding too harsh, because we're talking about a product that, given this day and age, I live in Burlington. I mean, this isn't just a Burlington issue. The amount of opioids out there, and that's a totally different league of problem, really.
Yes, I think one of the interesting things about the FDA's recent decision to move, they recommended moving cannabis Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. The definition of Schedule 1 is no accepted medical uses in the United States and high risk of physical dependence and abuse. And so when they're saying move it to Schedule 3, they're saying there are some accepted medical uses, and the risk of the kind of abuse profile is less than some of these other substances, including fentanyl, including cocaine, including heroin. And so it's an acknowledgement by the kind of public health agency of the United States that this probably should have never been Schedule 1 to begin with. And it's more along the lines of like Tylenol with codeine as far as the kind of addictiveness of it, or kind of the kind of abuse profile.
Well, let's talk about the market. As I mentioned, I live in Burlington. I was looking at the map of the dispensaries, which are now in the 70s, right?
We actually just approved 88.
88, okay. So I was looking at an outdated map. If you're at City Hall Park in Burlington, there is a dispensary. There have to be at least a half a dozen dispensaries within maybe a 4-minute walk.
Yeah.
Why did you, and I know there are probably more coffee shops in that same area, but why did you allow the concentration of dispensaries to be so much in that particular area?
Yeah, it's a challenge. You think about some of the things that you wish were done differently at the beginning. The Act 164, which created the Cannabis Board, gave us zero authority over retail siting. They actually I think the legislature thought that this was much more appropriate for local zoning boards, development review boards to figure out, because, and I understand it too, like sometimes you actually want a lot of cannabis dispensaries in high foot traffic areas. You don't want people necessarily driving to them or having a temptation to drive after they've consumed, go to a store, buy a pre-roll, smoke it, then hop in your car. However, some towns, I'm sure, also would like it on the outskirts so that their kids and other people aren't exposed to, cannabis on their walk to school or whatever else. And so the legislature said this is more of a local decision. They authorized towns to create these kind of local cannabis control commissions, essentially very similar to the liquor commissions. Mm-hmm. And I think the legislature thought they would be in charge of zoning. They could say something like, you can't have a cannabis shop within a mile of another cannabis shop, or 500 feet, whatever. Right. That never materialized, and it's not just Burlington. Morrisville, I think, has 6 cannabis shops. That's one situation that's playing out. The other kind of main driver of this clustering, this retail density, one of the red lines that the administration drew when they were contemplating, cannabis, was local towns should have the option of not having a cannabis shop. So the legislature, in response to that, knowing that the governor would not allow the bill to go through without that, they said, all right, well, so a town has to affirmatively opt in through a vote of its citizens before they can have a cannabis retail shop. So those 13 or so retail shops in Burlington are actually supplying the demand for cannabis, regulated cannabis, for Williston, which has not opted in, and South Burlington, which has not opted in. I think only about 30% of the towns in Vermont have opted in. So you're seeing, Morrisville, I said, has 6. Well, Stowe has 0. Mm-hmm. They haven't opted in. To me, that's a very kind of unnatural distribution of shops. I mean, it shouldn't be any surprise. What are there, I think, 3 liquor stores in all of Burlington? Right. You have 13 or 14 retail shops for cannabis. And they're not going to survive in the long term. I mean, I think we just saw one close in Burlington, actually. Right. There's just not... it's just not enough. There's just not enough of a population base to supply or to support 14 unique shops. The legislature did recognize this as a problem. Earlier this year, they finally decided to give the Cannabis Board the rulemaking authority to establish regulations around retail density. They said for any new application that we review, the board can kind of create rules around retail density, based upon population and needs of the market. So in our next round of rules, which are actually going to be published next month, we're taking a first crack at trying to identify what we think an area of saturation is, what that means based upon population, and try and encourage new retailers to kind of go to these underserved areas of the state.
And is there now a moratorium of some sort?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is we got this authority in July. We really had a fear that once we started putting pen to paper on this definition of saturated area and whatever else, that we were actually going to exacerbate the problem that we were trying to solve. What we're seeing even now, before we even have this kind of artificial cap on certain parts of the state for retail licenses, is that people really wanted to roll the dice and be the 15th store in Burlington with this heavily saturated market, because at least maybe they can kind of outlive one of their competitors and then they'll be the only place left. They would rather do that than go to the kind of, the Sharon or the kind of Newberry, Vermont, the smaller population area, and be the first or second there. So we thought as soon as we started really having the conversation about, all right, we're not going to allow any more in Rutland or Burlington or wherever else, that, through that 6-month process of promulgating a rule, that we would see more and more people trying to get their foot in the door.
Sneak in under the wire.
Yeah, exactly. So we did vote to just pause new retail applications. And as soon as these rules are kind of drafted and promulgated, we'll open it back up.
Do you buy a license?
The license for retail is $10,000. That's the fee. We're a unique state that doesn't have a cap on licenses. We're a very minority of state that doesn't cap the amount of licenses. So you have to meet our minimum qualifications and then pay the fee, and then you can operate.
Can I sell my license if I want to go out of business?
So the law is a little bit ambiguous on that. We have allowed that. But one of the other things, part of this kind of end of life cycle, package of legislation that we're going to be seeking from the legislature is also for them to explicitly weigh in on whether that license travels with the sale of a business or whether it reverts back to the state and the new business has to apply, for a new license.
Let's talk about the price of weed, and I will acknowledge up front this is secondhand information. What I'm hearing is that the price of weed, because this is so competitive in the Burlington area, that retailers are selling pot for pretty low prices. Do you track prices?
We do, yeah. This is all part of our inventory tracking. I mentioned that, anytime cannabis changes hands between licensees, it has to be tracked. And then anytime it's sold, it has to be tracked. I would say our prices are coming down largely because of the situation you described, which is highly competitive on the cultivation side. There's a lot of cultivators, and there's a huge amount of outdoor cultivators, and they all harvest at the same time, which really accelerates this price crash. It's a seasonal oversupply price dip issue that we're living through right now, and hopefully it evens out over the course of the year. Our prices are still higher than some of our neighboring states, Massachusetts and Maine especially.
Retail or the growers to the retailers?
Both.
Both,
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the market is still ramping up. We're still very early on in this industry. We're 2 years into regulated sales. So I fully expect the price to continue to decrease, but we're seeing good uptake. We're seeing in the kind of consumers. So where our sales are exceeding where the Joint Fiscal Office thought they were going to be.
I'll say.
And so I think the prices aren't so sky high that people are rejecting them and just kind of staying on the illicit market or kind of growing their own. But I think the prices will continue to come down, and one thing that we take very seriously and keep a very close eye on is this question about market saturation on the cultivation side. I mentioned that we have an uncapped licensing system. However, the legislature did say you can just shut down cultivation altogether. You can just stop issuing new licenses. And so the board never really wants to get to that point because I think it does fundamental harm to the nature of our market. But we have shut down all but our smallest cultivation tier. So anyone new who's getting in has to start at 1,000 square feet or less, which is a micro license. It doesn't even register in any other state. 1,000 square feet or less is just tiny. It's a really craft size license. And then we were granted authority earlier this year to allow people to expand into otherwise closed license types. So you have to start small, but if you kind of hit certain performance benchmarks, I used 75% of my space and I sold 75% of my product, you can reapply the next year at the tier up. You can kind of graduate. And then on the flip side, we also asked for the authority to kind of move people down. We have a few larger players that just kind of got in early and got a larger license type, but they're not using all their space. We want to kind of look at their performance benchmarks, say if you're not using at least 50% of your space and selling at least some amount of your product, you have to kind of be relegated down to the tier that actually is reflective of your production.
Mm-hmm. The estimate you mentioned before, the estimate was about $85 million by this time, and 2 years later, and it really came in closer to 125. I'm using ballpark numbers here.
Yeah.
Why was that number so? I mean, that's 50% off.
Yes, all I would say is,
in a good way.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
it's better to be 50% off that
way,
direction
right.
than the other way.
And that is part of it. Everyone was kind of throwing darts at a dartboard. You take drug use surveys, national surveys. You try and extrapolate what that's going to mean. You try and think about, well, New York hasn't legalized yet. New Hampshire hasn't legalized yet. How many of those border towns are going to send consumers to Vermont? How much tourism? I mean, we have 650,000 people. How many of those?
Last weekend.
Yeah. How many of those are over 21? And then we have, when we were looking at it, we had on average somewhere between 10 and 13 million individual tourist days in the state. So, how much tourism is going to push demand? There's assumptions built upon assumptions, and the Joint Fiscal Office cannot promise money that's never going to materialize.
Right.
So they actually they said 85 million. That was their kind of like
lowball.
Most likely. They said it could be this, but it's most likely going to be 85 million. They kind of gave a high, medium, and low range. Part of the thing that they thought too, their estimates actually increased over time. I think we ramped up this market a lot faster than they anticipated.
More consumers? Is it as simple as that?
No, I think they thought that we were going to issue licenses more slowly.
Okay.
Yeah, so we had more retail options. We had, at the end of FY24, we had 75 retail shops open. I think they thought maybe it would be half as many.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
How much weed do you think, or how much product, because it's more than just flower, it's gummies, it's edibles, everything else. How much of that do you think is slipping into youth hands?
It's hard to know that. I think it's maybe even less than when we just had home grow. I mean, the one metric that I like to look at is the accidental exposures, the New England poison control numbers, like how many people are calling poison control, and they break it out by age demographic. The biggest jump that we saw between year to year jump was,
let me guess, the 55 plus.
Well, I was going to say amongst youth, youth exposure.
Sorry.
Yeah, the kind of like accidental youth exposure, poison control calls, was the year that we legalized home grow, and then it's been growing ever since, but it's actually been growing at a less of a rate. So the rate of increase has slowed. And I think a lot of that has to do with some of these educational, the kind of change in tone of the education that's coming out. probably some of the after school money that's being spent, but then also the regulation that's here. I mean, child resistant packaging. I think that before, when we had home grow, people were probably growing, baking their brownies and leaving them out, and kids were, I mean, it's indistinguishable, a brownie that's out on the counter that's medicated versus one that's not. Now, cannabis kind of looks like radioactive waste, in all the packaging and child-resistant packaging, all the warning labels and all the kind of THC symbols. So I don't know the answer to your question, but, as far as the kind of poison control numbers, we're seeing the kind of rate of growth decelerate.
So you must track it for all ages, right?
Yeah.
So how many in a given year, this has been 2 years, so how many in a given year are reported for the entire population?
They are relatively low numbers. I think we're talking in the less than 50 in the kind of reported accidental exposures. And it's not a comprehensive number because it's not the emergency room reports. It's the people that call poison control.
Okay. So now, sitting here 2 years into this regulation and legality of it, what else do you wish you could go back in time and change?
One thing is, we didn't know what the entrepreneurial interest was going to be in getting a cannabis license. We knew that we wanted to prioritize small cultivators. We knew roughly what the demand for cannabis was going to be in the state amongst kind of, we at least had some economists look at this. So when we're sitting there in the ether of kind of how do we structure this market, and we don't want to drastically undersupply the market, because then we have lines around the block, empty shelves, it looks like a disaster. How could you let this happen? You don't want to drastically oversupply the market, because then you have these price crashes and no one can make any money at all, and you've just harmed a bunch of people that put a bunch of their own capital into this. So we created kind of 6 tiers of cultivation, some pretty big. We tried to make it the barriers to entry minimal on the small side, but we thought we might need some bigger players. So we have very few, but they're out there. And if I was going to start over again, probably just if I knew that there was going to be as much entrepreneurial demand on the small scale, I probably would have never created those larger tiers, or at least never opened them. So that's one thing. One thing that's industry practice, best practice now, is to have your own state reference lab. Every new state that's coming online invests in having its own state-run lab that keeps tabs on the independent labs, but also allows the Cannabis Board to do the amount of testing and develop methodologies around certain new products that they need to do. And our legislature originally, back in 2016, had money for a state reference lab. Through the kind of negotiations and whatever else, that money got cut out. But in 2022, or 2023, when we had a pesticide issue, they kind of recognized the need for this and put money back in. So I would have absolutely advocated for that money sooner. I'm always thinking that the tax rate needs to be lower. There's only so much price elasticity that consumers are willing to tolerate, and 20% is about there. That's kind of It's about as much as people are willing to tolerate, and then that doesn't even take into account all the regulatory compliance that gets baked into the cost of regulated cannabis. So I would love to see the tax rate decrease as well. 14%. Massachusetts is 10%, that excise tax. So, those are the types of things that I would like to see.
How much do you think you've reduced the legacy market?
Well, reduce is an interesting word.
Incorporate.
Yeah, I was going to say our goal really is to shift them. Other states, they are trying to stamp it out. They are effectively trying to replace the legacy market with businesses.
Well, let me ask the question this way. How much of what was previously the legacy market do you think still exists today?
A decent amount. I mean, you can go on Instagram and kind of see people that are trying to kind of sell on the illicit market. But, when I think about how much is in
Instagram, really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
any of the social medias. I mean, I hate to advertise for them, but yeah, they're out there. The way that I typically answer this question.
And is that legal? I mean,
No.
can you? Okay.
No,
All right.
no. To answer your question, though, I just try and look at the numbers. We have 380 or so cultivators. 75% of those are those tier 1 small cultivators growing on 1,000 square feet or less. That is the legacy market for the most part. Those are the people that were growing in their garage, their spare bedroom, wherever else. And they've decided to kind of join this market. I mean, to me, that's a huge market capture of the people. I mean, we're never going to get everyone. To say that we've been prosecuting and persecuting people for growing weed for, as long as this country, at least 100 years, to all of a sudden flip a switch and say, no, come on in, the water's warm, the government, from the government, we're here to help. So some people are just never going to buy that message. And, we've tried our best to kind of build trust and with the legacy market. And we've been, one of our very first meetings, we invited the kind of Growers Association in, and they're kind of the conduit in many ways to the legacy market. I think we've been successful, but we have to also now demonstrate that this industry is profitable, because it's the amount of regulation and the amount of costs. Like every operator, every kind of non-plant touching operator is allowed to charge a premium. It's required that you maintain insurance. General liability insurance. Well, there are no admitted insurers in Vermont, so none of the insurance companies that people are buying policies from are regulated by the Department of Financial Regulation. They're all these surplus line insurers, the people that will insure Beyonce's voice or Fabio's hair or whatever else. And they can charge whatever they want. And they can have exclusions in the fine print for even the things that you think you're paying for. So it's kind of an illusory plan. I mean, that's just one example. Obviously, landlords, when you say you're a cannabis company, they'll charge you extra for that. Bank accounts, very expensive, even just for a depository account. Everyone takes their kind of cut when it's cannabis. A lot of legacy operators will look at that situation and say, I think I'm okay, just kind of like selling to my friends and family, growing my 10 plants in my basement.
Kind of like people that grow their own vegetables.
Yeah. Brew their own beer.
Well, and that's probably a better analogy. That we've got just a ton of microbrewers and some that are outside the system.
Yeah.
How much money can I make as a grower? How much money can I make as a retailer?
There's a lot of variables to that. Obviously, we have 5 different tiers of cultivators.
Okay, say I grow 100 plants.
Yeah, and if you're indoors, you can get a minimum, usually about 4 turns, four harvests a year. If you're outdoors, you get 1. So there's a big kind of discrepancy there already. You probably can't grow 100 plants just by yourself. I mean, that's on the edge. So you need to have a business partner or an employee if you're growing 100 plants, probably indoors, most likely. Certainly, I think to your point, the retailers are making the most money. And I don't know how the competition in Burlington is impacting that, but, I think if you're a strategically placed retailer, I think one of our more successful ones is right in White River Junction. And they're capturing a lot of that, Dartmouth money. I mean, New Hampshire's nowhere near legalizing. They're a couple of years out at the minimum. So they're capturing a lot of that cross-border traffic. They're right at that kind of intersection with 89 and 91, and so they're getting a lot of people that are coming in to go skiing, things like that. But if you're getting, 4 turns a year with 100 plants, you're making a decent amount of money. I think a lot of the tier 1 outdoor cultivators that are just getting that one harvest, that's mostly just kind of supplemental income. I don't think that that's really viable as a potentially just a standalone business. But if you have that along with some, corn or some other crops, whatever else, then you can kind of make a living that way.
If I'm a retailer, there's a store right on College Street across from where the Free Press used to be, or this store that you just described, which sounds like it's in a primo spot in White River, 6 figures? What are we talking here?
Yeah, I would say so, but I wouldn't rely on me. I mean,
Well, do you know? Do you track that, or
we track sales? Yeah, but what we don't track necessarily is what what the net is. You know?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask the question another way. If I own a retail outlet in downtown Burlington or in a prime spot like what you described at the intersection of 89 and 91, what sort of living would you guess that I'm making? What's your gut feeling on this?
My guess is the owners of the store are doing quite well. I think they're most likely clearing six figures. And then as far as employees go, we try to require, we don't require, but we try to encourage paying a livable wage. I think most of the bud tenders and the people working in the stores are doing pretty well too, compared to, other sectors.
Where do you see the industry 2 years from now?
Great question. I got to say that we are in continuous competition, not just with the illicit market, but with the intoxicating hemp-derived products market, and that's a whole different topic that could take a long time to unpack. Intoxicating hemp-derived products industry is a $28 billion a year industry, and it's mostly serving the states that don't have legal cannabis. The cannabis industry last year was a $33 billion industry, but you can see they're starting to converge. So really, how our market evolves is really going to be kind of dependent on how the federal government starts treating intoxicating hemp-derived products and whether the FDA gets involved, whether the DEA gets involved. I think most states have some form of delivery license. We don't have that here. I'm not advocating for it, but it's kind of one of those things that, if every other state is doing it, maybe our Vermont legislature might look into it. Most states are starting to do special events, as in you could have a wedding or a concert where there's legal cannabis sales for on-site consumption. Nevada just opened their first brick-and-mortar consumption lounge. That could be something that the legislature wants to look at here. New York, all last year, was doing farmers markets for cannabis. Certainly when you think about kind of the Vermont way, we get asked all the time to create a direct-to-consumer, farmer-to-consumer, farm-gate sales license. You could certainly kind of see a 21-plus farmers market for cannabis that really showcases the individual growers and they can kind of tell their own story. Anytime that we can try and recognize how people are consuming and the kind of the services that are offered on the legacy market and put some regulation around them and offer that alternative on the regulated market, I think that's the kind of thing that the legislature wants us to be doing when they say that it's our job to shift the legacy market into the regulated space. They're not just talking about the operators; they're talking about the consumers as well. And so, I think those are some of the kind of next evolution of this market, not just in Vermont, but every state is starting to grapple with hospitality industry, special events, on-site consumption, delivery to a certain extent.
And I would imagine that if other states next to us, New Hampshire, for example, that could just be a big game changer.
If New Hampshire were to legalize?
Yeah.
Yeah, what we're seeing right now, which is I think is the even bigger game changer, is New York is starting to finally come online.
Right.
But, New Hampshire, it really, to me, the bill that almost made it, they got it to a conference committee and then it died in the Senate. That to me, that bill was kind of never really realistic. And then the governor kind of he drew some red lines in the sand about what things that he required, and it made it almost impossible to pass the bill. The next, Kelly Ayotte, who's running for governor, has already said, I'm not legalizing cannabis. Joyce Craig said, yeah, absolutely, we're going to do a cannabis legalization bill. So a lot will depend on how that governor's race turns out.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, of course.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.